Colleton County, South Carolina. April 1841. The first heat of the season had come early that year, and it felt as if the very air had thickened with secrets. The sun hung low and swollen, the light blurred by humidity. Spanish moss swayed from the oak trees like gray lace, brushing the backs of workers as they bent over the flooded rice fields of Cypress Grove Plantation. The river beyond the property, the slow, brown comb, moved as if reluctant to reach the sea. It was the kind of place where sound carried strangely. The echo of a whip might drift a half-mile before fading into the swamp, and sometimes, late at night, the cries of herons could be mistaken for something human. The plantation belonged to Silas Rutledge, a man whose life had been consumed by ambition long before anyone remembered what he used to be. He was not yet 50, but already looked older, the kind of thin that comes not from hunger but from worry sharpened into habit. His hair had turned gray early, and his eyes were a steel blue that never softened, even when he smiled. He had built his fortune the way most men in Colleton County did, from other people's misery. 58 enslaved men and women, 12 children, and 4 house servants lived and died under his rule. By the standards of the county, that made him comfortable, but not powerful. The true aristocracy, the Pelhams, the Fannings, the Crenshaws, owned hundreds of slaves and thousands of acres. Silas craved their respect the way other men craved drink. But what separated Silas Rutledge from most of his peers was not his greed. It was the kind of ambition that gnawed at him even in sleep, the need to be seen as more than ordinary. He attended every gathering, sponsored every dinner, offered gifts to judges and reverends, yet still found himself regarded with polite distance. He was the kind of man the powerful used but never fully accepted. His house, a grand Greek revival structure overlooking the rice fields, stood as his monument to belonging. Built in 1822, white columns lined the veranda, and the floors inside were imported mahogany polished to the color of blood. To outsiders, it looked like success. To those who lived within it, it felt more like a mausoleum. Silas had been widowed nearly 3 decades. His wife, Elizabeth, had been pragmatic and plain-spoken. A woman who believed that money was the only language men of the South truly understood. She died giving birth to their only child, Catherine, in the summer of 1813, leaving behind ledgers balanced to the last cent and a daughter destined to be both blessing and curse. Catherine Rutledge grew up under the watch of tutors and servants, rarely leaving the estate. For years, she had been bright, curious, even lovely in her way. But isolation, indulgence, and her father's obsession with appearances turned her into something fragile and strange. By 28, Catherine was spoken of in whispers. "Poor Miss Rutledge," the women of Colleton said when they passed her in church once a year. Such a shame she turned out. Wrong. They said it as though madness were contagious, something polite company should not touch. What they never guessed was that her madness was not born of delusion, but of truth. Truth she had seen at 12 years old, on a night she was never supposed to remember. Silas Rutledge sat in his study that April afternoon, a half-empty glass of bourbon sweating on the desk beside him. The plantation office smelled of tobacco, ink, and damp ledgers. It was here that he controlled his world, a world of numbers, debts, shipments, and names written in fine cursive under the heading Property Inventory. He was reviewing accounts when the knock came. A young house servant, Judith's boy, entered with a sealed envelope on a silver tray. The paper was thick, creamy, expensive, the kind used by judges and old families. But it was the seal that froze Silas in place. Pressed into red wax was the emblem of a scythe crossed with wheat stalks, the mark of the brethren of the harvest. For a long moment, he only stared at it, a faint tremor in his hand. Then slowly he broke the seal. The letter inside was brief, but every word hit like a hammer. "Brother Rutledge, your debts are past due. $12,000. Owed in full by the 1st of May. Failure to satisfy this obligation will result in forfeiture of holdings and loss of standing within the order. However, there remains an alternative, a demonstration of renewed faith, performed in the spirit of sacrifice and obedience. You will surrender your daughter, Catherine, into the full personal authority of one of your enslaved men for a period of 1 year. This act will signify your devotion to the natural order, the strong over the weak, the master over the fallen. Upon completion, your debt shall be forgiven and your position restored. Signed, the Brethren of the Harvest. Silas read it twice, then a third time. When the meaning finally settled, he set the paper down carefully, as though it might explode. It was madness. It was humiliation. It was exactly the kind of thing the Brethren demanded from those who owed them too much. He poured another bourbon and sat until the sun began to sink behind the trees. He thought of his options, few and all catastrophic. The Brethren controlled judges, lawyers, merchants. Defying them meant ruin or death. Obeying them meant sacrificing his last shred of dignity, yet dignity was a luxury for men who could afford it. Silas could not. He thought of Catherine, of her fits, her screams, her endless ramblings about what she'd seen, of the physicians who bled her, drugged her, tied her down. She was not a daughter anymore. She was a burden, a living embodiment of failure. Perhaps, he told himself, this was mercy. Perhaps the Brethren knew something he did not. By midnight, he had made his decision. He wrote his reply by candlelight. I accept the terms. The demonstration will proceed. The wax dripped thick and black onto the page as he sealed it. When the courier rode out before dawn, the plantation was still asleep. 3 days later, another letter came. This one thinner, businesslike. It listed a name, Ezekiel Cross, age 33, purchased through intermediary from a Virginia estate. Trained carpenter, capable herbalist of quiet temperament and strong constitution. There were no further details, but Silas knew what this meant. The Brethren were providing the man. When the wagon arrived on April 13th, Silas was waiting on the veranda. It was an unusually direct delivery, not to the barns, not to the overseer's yard, but straight to the front steps of the house. A trader named Henderson climbed down from the driver's seat. Your man as requested, he said. Paid in full by your associates. Silas nodded, though his pulse quickened. He moved closer to inspect the new arrival. Ezekiel sat in the wagon bed, wrists bound loosely in front of him. He was tall, easily 6'2", with a body built from labor and endurance. His eyes were dark, his skin the color of polished oak. Unlike most enslaved men, he met Silas's gaze without flinching. It was not defiance, not quite. More the steady attention of someone who understood the measure of danger. You understand why you're here? Silas asked. Yes, sir, Ezekiel said quietly. His voice carried the trace of a Virginia accent. To tend to your daughter. More than that, Silas replied. You are to oversee her entirely. Her care, her behavior, her condition. You will obey my instructions without question. Do you understand? Yes, sir. The exchange was brief. Silas signed the papers Henderson offered, took the keys to Ezekiel's shackles, and dismissed the trader. Then he turned to the man who had once been property of another and now was his most dangerous possession. You'll stay in the cabin by the garden close to the main house, Silas said. You begin tomorrow. Yes, sir. That night, the cabin was silent, except for the hum of crickets and the occasional hiss of wind through the pine boards. Ezekiel sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring at his calloused hands. He waited until the footsteps outside faded, until the plantation settled into the heavy stillness of midnight. Then he reached under his shirt and drew out a small cloth bundle. Inside was a torn scrap of paper, edges worn from years of handling. 3 names, written in a child's shaky hand, Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, his wife and children, gone, not from fever or accident, but because of this man. Silas Rutledge had sold them 3 years earlier to a plantation in Alabama, known for working slaves to death. He had done it not from necessity, but to prove to the Brethren his strength, his ability to sacrifice sentiment for power. Ezekiel had learned of their deaths slowly, through whispers carried from one plantation to another. Sarah dead of fever, Benjamin from an infected wound, Ruth from heartbreak. For 2 years, he had followed the rumor of Silas Rutledge, arranging to be sold ever southward. It had taken cunning and endurance to land here. He had told himself that vengeance was a fool's dream, but vengeance was all that kept him alive. Now the man who destroyed his life had placed him inside his own house. Ezekiel looked at the scrap of paper one more time, then folded it carefully and slipped it back beneath his shirt. He lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the rough beams above him. He whispered their names again, not in grief this time, but in promise. Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, I found him. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, and the swamp seemed to breathe. Somewhere beyond the trees, the faint glow of the big house flickered through the night. Inside that house, a woman drugged into silence slept in a darkened room, and her father dreamed of power. Neither of them knew that the man sleeping in the cabin below was already planning their salvation and their ruin. When dawn came, the sky burned copper over the river. Ezekiel rose, washed his hands, and stepped outside into the humid air. He looked toward the house and felt the old rage settle into something cold and sharp. Today he would meet Catherine Rutledge, and nothing in Cypress Grove would ever be the same again. The morning light over Cypress Grove had the color of diluted honey, soft and hazy through the swamp mist. It was the kind of light that made everything look deceptive, peaceful, even beautiful. If one didn't listen too closely to the cries of the fields. Ezekiel Cross stood by the kitchen well, washing his hands in cold water before Judith, the housekeeper, approached him. Judith was a heavy-set woman in her 50s, her eyes ringed by the kind of exhaustion that came from decades of servitude. She studied him in silence for a moment, as if measuring the new man against a lifetime of caution. "You're the one they brought for Miss Catherine?" she asked at last. "Yes, ma'am." Judith shook her head slowly. "God help you then." "She's not right. Not since she was a child. Screams some nights till morning. Other nights she's quiet, but it's a kind of quiet that freezes your bones." Ezekiel nodded. "I'll do what I can." "That's what they all say," Judith muttered. Doctors, priests, even her father. None lasted long. The old woman handed him a tray with a porcelain bottle, a small teacup, and a folded napkin. "She takes her medicine with breakfast. Or she's supposed to. Her father insists on it. What's in it?" Judith gave him a look. "You'll see soon enough." Catherine Rutledge's room was on the second floor, at the far end of a hall lined with portraits. The eyes of long-dead ancestors followed Ezekiel as he climbed the stairs. Pale faces, powdered wigs, women holding parasols beside husbands in uniforms. All of them seemed to share one feature, a certain pride, a belief that they were made to rule. He paused outside her door. From within came a rhythmic scraping sound, like furniture being dragged slowly across the floor, followed by a crash. Judith hesitated beside him, clutching her apron. "She's in one of her moods. Let me speak to her alone," Ezekiel said. The woman's eyes widened. "Alone? That ain't wise. Your master told me I'm to care for her. Let me do what he brought me for." Judith hesitated, then sighed. "Suit yourself. I'll be right down the hall if she starts throwing things again." She knocked gently. "Miss Catherine? There's someone here your father sent. Send him away," came the muffled shout. Something shattered against the wall. Judith grimaced and stepped back. Ezekiel took a breath and turned the handle. The door creaked open into semi-darkness. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light, and the air smelled faintly of sweat and sweet decay, laudanum and sickness. Catherine sat slumped in a chair near the fireplace. Her hair was a tangled storm around her pale face, her eyes sunken, her body swathed in a soiled dressing gown. Books and broken glass littered the carpet. For a long moment she didn't move. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw the tall stranger standing in her doorway. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice thick and slurred. "My name is Ezekiel," he said quietly. "Your father sent me to help you." Her lips twisted into something between a sneer and a smile. "Help, that's what they all say. They bleed me, they drug me, they call it help. I'm not a doctor. Then what are you?" He hesitated. "Someone who wants to see you well." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed in the hollow room. "You think I can be well? Do you know what's been done to me?" "I know what sickness looks like," he said softly, setting the tray down. "And I know poison when I smell it." The words stopped her. Her eyes flicked to his face, suddenly alert. "Poison?" she whispered. Ezekiel stepped forward, examining the bottle on the tray. He uncorked it and sniffed. The sharp metallic tang of mercury filled the air. "This isn't medicine," he said. "It's killing you slowly." Catherine's breathing quickened. "You're lying." Your father doesn't want you cured," Ezekiel interrupted. "He wants you quiet, obedient, easier to hide away." She stared at him, her lips trembling. "You don't know him. I know his kind," Ezekiel said. "And I know what he's done." Catherine stood unsteadily, gripping the chair. Her face flushed with effort, but her voice was clearer now. "What has he done? Tell me." Ezekiel looked at her for a long time. Things no man should do. To others, to his own blood. You were never sick, Miss Catherine. You were silenced. She sank back into the chair, shaking. For a moment he thought she might scream, but instead she whispered, I always suspected. But I was a child. When I told them what I saw, they said I was hysterical. They locked me away. What did you see? He asked carefully. Her gaze drifted to the fireplace, unfocused. In the cellar. I followed my father one night when I was 12. I thought he was meeting other planters for business. But there were candles. Chanting, a woman crying. They tied her to a table. Her voice faltered. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. They cut her, and then they prayed over the blood. The silence in the room thickened. Catherine's eyes filled with tears that did not fall. He told me it wasn't real. He said I'd had a nightmare. Then he made me drink that medicine. Every day since. Ezekiel's hands tightened on the edge of the tray. He's still part of it. That's why I'm here. She looked at him sharply. You? Why you? Because your father owes a debt. The men he serves sent me here as his punishment. He doesn't know I already have my own reasons. Reasons? He sold my family, Ezekiel said simply. My wife and children. To prove himself to those same men. They're all dead because of him. Catherine closed her eyes. The brethren, she said at last. The brethren of the harvest. He sold them for them. You know about them? A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Know about them? I watched them feed the land with human blood. I heard them say the crops grow richer for every life taken. I know exactly what they are. She leaned forward, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. If you mean to destroy him, Ezekiel, then you'll need me. Ezekiel hesitated. You're not well enough to fight. Then make me well, she said fiercely. Take away the poison. Give me back my mind, he nodded slowly. It won't be easy. Your body depends on the laudanum. Stopping will hurt. You'll shake, sweat, scream. You'll wish to die before you feel better. Her grip tightened. I already wish to die. But not before I see him suffer. Their eyes met. Two broken lives recognizing each other in the ruins. Then we have an understanding, Ezekiel said. She released him, slumping back into the chair, but there was something new in her face now. Not madness, but determination. Start tomorrow, she said. Burn the medicine. Bring me something real. The following days blurred into a haze of agony. Ezekiel began reducing the laudanum slowly. Mixing it with herbal tinctures, he brewed himself from plants gathered near the swamp. Valerian for sleep, chamomile for calm, milk thistle to cleanse her poisoned blood. Catherine suffered through every stage of withdrawal, fever, shaking, vomiting, hallucinations that left her screaming for hours. Yet through it all, Ezekiel stayed. He held her hair when she retched, wiped her brow, whispered prayers under his breath that she was too delirious to hear. On the third night, her fever broke. She lay motionless, drenched in sweat, her face pale but peaceful. When she finally opened her eyes, they were clearer than they had been in years. How long? She asked weakly. 3 days. I saw them, she murmured. In my dreams. The brethren. Standing over that woman again. They can't hurt you now, Ezekiel said. She turned her head toward him. You don't understand. They don't die. Men like them never do, unless someone makes them. By the end of the second week, Catherine could walk the length of the hallway without collapsing. Judith whispered prayers every time she saw her upright. Even Silas noticed the change, though he attributed it to his own wisdom in hiring new help. He summoned Ezekiel to the study. You've done well, Silas said, pouring himself a drink. She's calmer, more manageable. She's stronger, Ezekiel corrected. Silas gave him a narrow look. Watch your tone. Yes, sir. Silas leaned back, studying him. You have knowledge, I'll grant you that. But remember your place. My daughter may be your charge, but she remains my blood. Ezekiel bowed his head, but his hands clenched behind his back. Of course, sir. When he returned to Catherine's room that night, she was sitting by the window, gazing at the moonlight through the curtains. He called you to his study, she said quietly. I heard his voice. Yes. What did he say? That you're more manageable. Her laugh was low and bitter. He always measures people by how easily they bend. She turned toward him, her eyes bright in the dim light. We're running out of time. He'll suspect something soon. What do you mean? She stood steady now, her movements deliberate. There's more in that house than medicine and lies. There's a room beneath the cellar, a hidden one. I've heard them speak of it. That's where the ledger is. Ledger? Their record. Every ritual, every name, every death. My father once said it ensures loyalty. No one can betray the brethren without betraying themselves. Ezekiel felt a chill crawl down his spine. And you know where it is? Not exactly, but I can find it. He studied her in silence. The weak, trembling woman he had met days ago was gone. In her place stood someone sharp, purposeful, terrifying in her calm. If we find that ledger, she said, we can destroy them all. And what then? Then we burn it. The house, the proof, everything. Let the county think it was an accident. That's the only way this ends. Ezekiel hesitated. You've thought this through. I've had 16 years to think, she said coldly. That night, as the plantation slept, Catherine sat at her desk by candlelight writing. The fever had left her hands shaky, but her mind was clear. She opened an old journal filled with coded markings, symbols she had invented years ago when the drugs dulled her thoughts but not her will. Each line corresponded to a name, a date, a meeting she'd overheard through the floorboards. She began decoding, line by line, whispering the names like a prayer for vengeance. Pelam, Fanning, Crenshaw, Ruttled. The ink blurred once from a tear that slipped down her cheek, but she did not stop writing. When Ezekiel entered quietly near dawn, she didn't look up. It's almost ready, she said. Soon you'll see what kind of men rule this land. He placed something on her desk, a folded scrap of paper. My family's names, he said softly. So you'll know why I fight. She opened it, reading each name aloud. Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, then folded it carefully. They won't be forgotten, she said. Not while I live. The days that followed were filled with a strange, electric calm. Catherine regained her strength quickly, walking through the house as if reclaiming territory that had been stolen from her. Servants whispered of miracles. Silas, oblivious to what was building beneath his own roof, decided to make a spectacle of his daughter's recovery. He announced a dinner for April 29th, 40 guests, the county's elite. Catherine would sit beside him, proof of his authority, a demonstration that even madness could be tamed by his will. When Ezekiel told her, she smiled thinly. Let him celebrate, she said. He thinks he's in control. That's always his mistake, he frowned. It'll be dangerous. Too many eyes, too many ears. I want them to see me, Catherine said. I want them all to see the woman they buried alive. She turned back to the window, the candlelight flickering across her face. Let him have his feast. When it ends, we begin. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the swamps, a warning of storms to come. Catherine didn't flinch. She welcomed the sound. That night, Ezekiel lay awake in his cabin, staring at the ceiling. The wind carried the scent of rain and the faint rustle of chains from the quarters. He thought of the ledger, of the men who would soon fill that house, of Catherine's fire. For the first time in years, he felt something close to hope, not for mercy, but for justice, sharp and righteous as a blade. He whispered again the names written on his paper. Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, then, almost as an afterthought, he added another name to the prayer, Catherine. The night seemed to answer with a distant rumble. In less than 2 weeks, the storm would break, and when it did, Cypress Grove would burn. April 29th, 1841, Cypress Grove Plantation, Colleton County, South Carolina. The storm that had rumbled for days finally broke on the morning of the dinner. The sky hung low and swollen, the air charged with static, as if the land itself knew something dreadful was about to occur. By mid-afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a world slick and steaming. Servants hurried through puddles carrying trays, silverware, and candelabras, their reflections warped in the wet cobblestones. Inside, the great house came alive with the sound of preparation, dishes clattering, wood crackling in the hearth, voices calling orders in nervous tones. Cypress Grove had never looked more grand. Chandeliers glowed like captured stars, and the long mahogany dining table gleamed under their light. White flowers filled crystal vases, masking the faint, sour smell that always seemed to cling to the place. The odor of damp earth and something older, more organic, that lived beneath the floors. Ezekiel moved silently among the servants, arranging chairs and pouring wine. No one paid him any mind. To the guests who would soon arrive, he was invisible, a shadow in a dark suit, a faceless hand refilling their glasses. But his eyes missed nothing. He had been waiting for this night. From the moment Silas announced the dinner, Ezekiel knew what it meant. It was not celebration. It was theater, a performance for the county's powerful men and for the brethren who hid among them. Tonight Silas would prove his devotion in public, and Catherine would play her role. Upstairs, Judith helped Catherine dress. The gown had once belonged to her mother, pale blue silk trimmed with white lace, now slightly faded but still elegant. "You sure about this, child?" Judith asked, fastening the back. "You look near good as new, but I can see the fire in your eyes." "Don't let him see too much of that." Catherine met her gaze in the mirror. "He'll see what I want him to see." Judith hesitated, then said softly, "Sometimes it's better to survive quiet than to die proud." "I've done enough surviving," Catherine replied. "Tonight I live." By 7 o'clock, the carriages began to arrive. Wheels crunched over gravel, voices called out greetings, and laughter echoed under the dripping trees. Judge Pelham and his wife were first, the judge's belly straining against his vest, his wife's neck glittering with diamonds that caught the candlelight. Reverend Crenshaw came next, his hands folded as if in prayer, but his eyes sharp as a hawk's. The Fannings, the Lyles, the merchant families, all came dressed in silk and arrogance. They dined beneath portraits of dead Rutledges, who seemed to watch the proceedings with silent approval. Silas Rutledge stood at the head of the table, smiling like a man who had finally triumphed. "My friends," he began, his voice rich with false warmth, "thank you for joining us on this special evening. You all know my daughter Catherine." Every head turned. Catherine sat at his right hand, upright, composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Gasps rippled down the table. The madwoman of Cypress Grove, the ghost no one had seen in years, looked almost regal. "My father's doctors have been tireless," she said calmly, "and the Lord has seen fit to reward their efforts." Her tone was smooth, her eyes distant. Only Ezekiel, moving behind her with a decanter, saw the white of her knuckles where she gripped the napkin beneath the table. Dinner began. Dishes appeared in endless succession: roasted duck, oysters, candied yams, rice, wine. The talk turned to politics, the price of cotton, the rumors of unrest among slaves in Georgia. Laughter swelled and faded like tides. Catherine said little, but when spoken to, she replied with perfect courtesy. The women marveled at her composure. The men studied her with uneasy fascination. Then came dessert, a towering cake dusted with sugar like snow. Silas tapped his glass for silence. "My friends," he said, "you know the trials I have faced with my daughter's condition. For years, physicians failed to cure her. We tried every remedy, every prayer, every sacrifice. Nothing brought peace." He gestured toward Ezekiel. "Until this man arrived." Murmurs rippled through the room. Several guests glanced at each other in disbelief. "In just 2 weeks," Silas continued, "Miss Catherine has shown more improvement than in 2 decades. Her mind is clear, her strength restored. And so, after much prayer and consideration, I have made a decision." He paused, savoring the attention. "I am placing my daughter, Catherine Rutledge, under the permanent care and full authority of this man, Ezekiel Cross." The reaction was instant. Utensils clattered. Gasps broke the air. Judge Pelham's face turned crimson. "Silas, you can't be serious." Reverend Crenshaw leaned forward, his voice strained. "To give your daughter to a slave? I give her to the only one who succeeded where others failed," Silas said coldly. "Her health is worth more than pride." "You'll be ruined," Pelham hissed. The brethren. But Silas's sharp glare silenced him. Ezekiel kept his head bowed, expression neutral, but inside he could feel the tension crackling like lightning. Catherine's pulse hammered visibly in her throat. Silas turned toward her. "You agree, do you not, my dear?" The room waited. Catherine looked up slowly, her smile composed, her voice steady. "I trust my father's judgment." A murmur swept through the table. Confusion, pity, disgust. None saw the flicker in her eyes, the tiny flash of defiance. The dinner continued awkwardly, conversation forced. By midnight, the guests began to leave, whispering to one another as they climbed into their carriages. When the last had gone, the house fell silent except for the crackle of the dying fire. Ezekiel found Catherine in her room, still in her gown, staring out the window. "It's done," she said without turning. "He's humiliated himself. They'll whisper about him for years." Ezekiel closed the door. "And you?" "I did what I had to." She looked at him finally, her eyes shining in the candlelight. "They think I'm broken. Let them." She moved to her dresser and opened a wooden box. Inside lay pages covered in her delicate handwriting, columns of symbols and dates. "I've been keeping records for years," she said. "Everything I've seen, everything I remember. The names of those who visited at night. I wrote it all down, but in code so he'd never understand." She handed him one page. "That's how we'll destroy them." Ezekiel studied the markings, strange combinations of letters and numbers, repeating patterns. "You remember where they meet?" "In the cellar. There's a hidden door behind the wine racks. It leads to a chamber only the brethren use." He looked up. "And you want to go down there?" "I need to," she said. "If the ledger is there, it's the proof we need. Once we have it, we can expose everything." Ezekiel hesitated. "You're talking about entering the heart of their hell. If they catch us, then we die," she interrupted simply. "But if we don't, they win. And they keep winning. Forever." Her voice didn't tremble. There was no madness in her tone, only clarity, cold and righteous. He nodded slowly. "Then we'll go. When?" "My father leaves for Charleston on May 14th. He'll be gone 3 days. That's our chance." The next 2 weeks passed in deceptive calm. Catherine continued her act, walking in the gardens, smiling when spoken to, attending church. Silas, pleased by her obedience, began to relax. Ezekiel used the time to map the house. He learned the servants' schedules, the routes of the overseers, the times the house slept. He located the trapdoor in the kitchen pantry that led to the cellar. At night, he and Catherine met in secret, going over her notes by candlelight. The more Ezekiel read, the colder his blood ran. The Brethren were not simply a local cult. They were part of a network stretching across the South: Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, Richmond. Men of wealth and influence who believed their prosperity came from ritual blood. Catherine translated one entry aloud, her voice tight. "The soil hungers, the land remembers. Feed it the weak and reap the strong. 40 years, she whispered. "They've been doing this for 40 years. Ezekiel stared at the page. "How many have they killed?" She turned another sheet. "At least 37, maybe more. Slaves? Mostly some poor whites. A few children. Anyone who wouldn't be missed." She hesitated. "I think one of them was my mother's maid. She vanished a week before the harvest of 1813. Father told me she ran away." The candlelight flickered across her face, making her look older, harder. "I've lived my whole life in that house," she said, "and I never realized how much blood is buried beneath it." Ezekiel touched the folded paper in his pocket, the one with his family's names. "It's time someone made them answer for it." May 14th arrived. Silas departed at dawn, his carriage rumbling down the long dirt road toward Charleston. By nightfall, the house was still. Catherine waited until the last lamp in the servants' quarters went dark, then slipped from her room dressed in black. Ezekiel met her in the kitchen. "Ready?" he whispered. She nodded. Behind the pantry shelves, a section of the wall shifted when pressed in just the right spot. A faint click, and the door swung inward, revealing narrow stairs descending into darkness. A wave of cold, damp air rose from below. Ezekiel lit a shuttered lantern. "Stay close." The steps creaked under their weight. The air grew thick with the smell of earth and rot. At the bottom, the passage opened into a large chamber, the Brethren's cellar. Catherine froze, memories flooding back. "It's the same," she whispered. Exactly the same. The room was circular, about 30 feet wide, with low stone walls weeping moisture. Iron hooks hung from beams. A massive wooden table stood at the center, dark stains soaking the grain. Ezekiel set down the lantern. Its light fell across shelves lined with clay jars sealed in wax, a rack of black robes trimmed in red, and books. Dozens of them. He crossed to the far wall. "You said there's a hidden room." Catherine pointed to a section where the stones looked newer. She pressed one with her palm. A soft click echoed, and part of the wall swung inward. Beyond it lay a smaller room, the inner chamber. The smell hit them first. Iron, smoke, and something old and sweet like decay, In the center stood a lectern supporting a massive ledger bound in dark leather with iron clasps. "There," Catherine breathed. "That's it," Ezekiel approached cautiously. The book was heavy, its cover etched with the same scythe and wheat emblem that had sealed Silas's letter. He opened it. The pages were thick, covered in meticulous handwriting. Dates, names, rituals, written as if recording business transactions. Catherine leaned over his shoulder, her hands trembling. "Look, the first entry, 1800, she read aloud. "The soil has accepted the gift. The harvest shall be abundant." They turned page after page, each entry colder than the last. Detailed descriptions of sacrifices, participants, even instructions for preparation of the flesh. Ezekiel's breath came shallow. Then he saw it. October 1838. Purchased family unit from Virginia. Woman Sarah, children Benjamin and Ruth, separated from male to demonstrate resolve. Sent to Alabama contact. Payment received, 3 lines. That was all. Ezekiel's vision blurred. He gripped the edge of the lectern to steady himself. Catherine touched his arm. "Your family?" He nodded, unable to speak. "We take it," she said. "The ledger. It ends tonight." "No," he whispered. "If we take it now, they'll know. We copy what we need." He was right. Burning desire for vengeance was one thing. Survival required patience. They worked for hours, copying names and passages onto loose pages, focusing on the most damning evidence. Sweat mixed with dust and ink. Several times Catherine's hand shook so badly she had to stop. Finally, she whispered, "Enough." "We have what we need." Ezekiel closed the ledger and stepped back. The air in the chamber seemed to shift, heavier, as if the walls themselves were watching. "Let's go." They turned toward the door and froze. A light flickered in the outer cellar, brighter than their lantern. Footsteps, voices. Ezekiel's stomach dropped. He doused the lantern, too late. Silas Rutledge's voice cut through the darkness, calm and cold. "I must say, I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd find the inner chamber." The light grew as he stepped into view, flanked by 2 men with pistols drawn. Behind them, more figures waited in the shadows. Catherine's breath caught. "You were supposed to be in Charleston." "I was," Silas said. "But I've never been one to trust miracles. So I came home early." He stepped closer, the glow of his lantern throwing sharp lines across his face. "You've been very busy, my dear." "And you?" He nodded to Ezekiel. "I see now why they sent you. I underestimated your ambition." Ezekiel stood still, calculating. 7 men, maybe 8. "No escape," Silas gestured lazily with his hand. "Bring them upstairs. We have much to discuss." They were locked in the study together, Catherine and Ezekiel, while footsteps echoed through the house above. Catherine paced, her gown torn, her hair disheveled. "He'll summon them," she said. "The brethren! They'll kill us." Ezekiel sat by the windowless wall, thinking fast. "Not yet. He wants to use us first." She stopped. "Then we use him." Before he could ask, she pulled from her sleeve a handful of the copied pages. "He didn't search me." Ezekiel almost smiled despite the situation. "You planned for this?" "I always plan for the worst," she said. Outside, thunder rolled again, the storm returning. Within the hour, more footsteps came. The lock turned. "Time to face judgment," a voice said. Ezekiel looked at Catherine. "Whatever happens, don't lose your courage." She lifted her chin. "I lost everything else." "That I'll keep." The door opened. Men in black robes waited beyond. Together, they stepped into the hall, into the glow of flickering candles leading down toward the cellar, toward the heart of the Brethren's power, and the night that would decide who lived and who burned. June 3rd, 1841, Cypress Grove Plantation. The air that night was thick with thunder. Lightning flared across the horizon, illuminating the distant swamp in flashes of white-blue light. From the great house, faint strains of music drifted from the drawing room, a phonograph Silas had imported from Charleston playing a solemn hymn. But beneath that genteel sound came another rhythm, the dull, heavy thud of boots descending into the cellar. Ezekiel and Catherine were led down by torchlight, their hands bound behind them. The stairs were slick with moisture. The smell of mold and old blood grew stronger with every step. When they reached the bottom, the sight that awaited them froze the breath in their throats. The brethren of the harvest had gathered in full regalia. 13 men, including Silas Rutledge, stood in a perfect circle around the altar. Their robes were black, their hoods embroidered with red wheat stalks. Candles filled every crevice of the chamber, their flames trembling as if afraid of what they illuminated. At the center, the wooden table, the altar, was draped in crimson cloth. Something lay upon it, covered by a sheet. "Welcome," Silas said, his voice carrying easily over the low chant that filled the room. "Tonight you both will serve a higher purpose." Catherine's eyes blazed. "You call murder a purpose?" "Sacrifice," Silas corrected. "A gift to the land, to the order that sustains us." Ezekiel's gaze moved slowly around the circle. He recognized several faces behind the hoods: Judge Pelam, Reverend Crenshaw, Marcus Fanning, the same men who had dined here 2 weeks ago, their laughter masking rot. "Untie him," Silas ordered. He must be free to make his choice. The ropes fell away from Ezekiel's wrists. 2 men stepped forward and removed the sheet from the altar. Beneath it lay a young woman, enslaved, bound hand and foot, a gag over her mouth. She couldn't have been older than 19. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the candlelight like wet glass. "This," Silas said, "is your test. You claim to hate me, yet you accepted your role. Tonight you will prove your loyalty to the brethren, or die with her." Ezekiel's stomach turned cold. "What do you want me to do?" "Take the knife," Silas said. "Begin the ritual." A man stepped forward holding a blade, long, gleaming, wickedly curved. "You expect me to become one of you?" Ezekiel said. "I expect you to survive," Silas replied. "You want revenge for your family. I can give it to you. Serve us, and I'll see that the man who killed them, Edward Gaines of Alabama, dies by your hand. Refuse, and both you and my daughter will die tonight." Catherine struggled against the men restraining her. "Don't listen to him," she shouted. "He's lying." Silas turned to her, almost tenderly. "You should be grateful, my dear. I've spared you this test. You'll die quickly." Ezekiel stood motionless. His heart hammered so loudly he could barely hear the chanting. The faces around him blurred. 13 men, 13 monsters. He looked down at the terrified girl on the altar, at the knife gleaming in the candlelight. He thought of Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, his family torn apart, written into a ledger as a mere transaction. He reached for the knife. A murmur of approval rippled through the circle. Silas smiled. "Good. You're learning what it takes to endure." Ezekiel held the knife, weighing it. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, waiting. Then he moved. The blade flashed once, not toward the girl, but toward the nearest man. The knife buried itself deep in the man's throat. Hot blood sprayed across the altar. The man gurgled, clutching at the wound, collapsing to the floor. For one heartbeat, there was silence. Then chaos. Ezekiel snatched the fallen man's torch and hurled it across the room. Flames leapt up as a robe caught fire. Someone shouted. Another drew a pistol. Catherine screamed, "Run!" The girl on the altar thrashed wildly. Ezekiel cut her bonds with the same knife, then shoved her toward the stairs. "Go! Don't stop until you see the trees!" Gunfire exploded, deafening in the enclosed space. A bullet grazed Ezekiel's shoulder, spinning him sideways. He slammed into another man, wrested the pistol from his hand, and fired back. The shot hit Reverend Crenshaw square in the chest. The room dissolved into panic, the brethren shouting, tripping over one another's robes. The altar toppled, candles falling, wax spilling like blood. Through the smoke and screaming, Ezekiel saw Silas retreat toward the far wall, shouting for order. "Stop him!" "Stop," he never finished. Catherine lunged for him, snatching a fallen dagger. She slashed across his arm, drawing a line of red. "You taught me to obey," she hissed. "Now you can learn what defiance feels like." Silas staggered back, eyes wild. "You ungrateful." Before he could strike her, a sudden roar echoed from above, the sound of doors breaking, feet pounding down the stairs. For a moment, Ezekiel thought reinforcements had come for Silas. Then he saw them. Men and women, dozens of them, storming into the cellar, wielding axes, pitchforks, and sickles. Their faces shone with sweat and fury. They were the enslaved people of Cypress Grove, led by Judith, their housekeeper. And behind them, lightning flashed through the doorway, illuminating their eyes. Bright, fearless, burning, Catherine shouted, "No!" The brethren turned too late. The uprising hit like a tidal wave. The cellar became a maelstrom of fire and screams. The servants who had lived their lives in silence now struck with generations of anger. Pelham tried to run and was cut down before he reached the stairs. Fanning fell beneath a hammer blow that shattered his skull. Crenshaw's robes caught fire, turning him into a living torch. Ezekiel fought alongside them, his movements instinctive, relentless. The blade in his hand became an extension of his rage. Silas tried to flee, dragging Catherine with him, the edge of a pistol pressed against her neck. "Stop," he shouted. "Stop or I'll kill her." The battle froze. The flames crackled. Catherine stood rigid in his grasp, her face pale but calm. "Go on then," she said softly. "Kill me. It won't save you." Silas's hand shook. "I can still start over. I can rebuild." "You don't understand what I've done for you," she laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "You destroyed everything you touched and called it sacrifice." With sudden, brutal strength, she drove her elbow into his ribs. He gasped, loosening his grip just enough. Ezekiel lunged forward, seizing Silas's wrist and twisting. The pistol clattered to the ground. They faced each other, master and slave, father and executioner, two men bound by hate. "You took my family," Ezekiel said. "You killed them for nothing." Silas staggered backward, blood dripping from his arm. "I gave you purpose. Without me, you'd still be in chains." Ezekiel's expression didn't change. "You were right about one thing. The weak feed the strong. But tonight you are the weak." He drove the knife into Silas's chest. The old man's eyes went wide. His mouth opened as if to speak, but only blood came out. He fell to his knees, staring up at Ezekiel as though unable to believe it was possible to die. Then he collapsed onto the dirt floor, his lifeblood mingling with the others. Catherine watched in silence. For a long moment she did not move. Then she said quietly, "It's done." Ezekiel nodded, his breath ragged. "No, not yet." He turned to the remaining brethren. A few still lived, crawling through the smoke. Ezekiel looked to the others, Judith and the freed slaves, and they understood without words. No one begged. No one hesitated. The reckoning was complete. When the last echo of struggle faded, the cellar was a ruin, bodies everywhere, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning flesh. Catherine stood in the center, trembling, her gown torn, her face streaked with soot. She looked around slowly, as if waking from a long nightmare. Ezekiel came to her side. "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered. "Are you?" He touched the graze on his shoulder. Not enough. They both looked toward Silas's body. His hand still clutched at the dirt as though even in death he couldn't let go of his land. "What do we do now?" Ezekiel asked. Catherine stared at the walls, at the ledger still sitting on its stand, untouched by fire. "We burn it," she said. "All of it. Every trace. But the ledger will damn us both if anyone finds it." "Justice isn't in the law, Ezekiel. It's here." She touched her chest. "In what we remember." She turned to Judith. "Take everyone who wants to leave. Go before dawn. Tell them nothing of what happened." "Not ever," Judith nodded solemnly. "The swamps will hide us." "Ain't nobody gonna talk." Ezekiel lifted the ledger from the stand and opened it one last time. He tore out 3 pages, the ones bearing his family's names, and folded them carefully. "For them," he said. Then he placed the rest of the book back on the altar. Catherine found a jar of lamp oil and began pouring it across the floor, over the robes, over the bodies. The smell filled the chamber. Ezekiel struck a match, for a heartbeat. They both hesitated, 2 souls on the edge of erasing the past. Then he dropped the flame. Fire spread like judgment. It crawled up the altar, devouring the ledger, racing along the oil-soaked floor. The heat roared, reflecting off the wet stone walls. They ran, the flames chasing them up the stairs. When they burst into the kitchen, the ceiling above already glowed orange. Outside, rain began again, hard, hissing against the flames, but not enough to stop them. Ezekiel and Catherine stood in the yard, gasping, watching the inferno consume the great house. The firelight painted their faces in gold and red. "People will come," Ezekiel said. "They'll ask questions." "They'll believe what we tell them," Catherine replied. A candle fell. A tragic accident. All of them trapped below. He looked at her, the flickering light reflecting in his dark eyes. "And you?" "I'll go north. I've money hidden, enough to start again." He nodded. "Then I'll go west. There are people who help others escape. I'll find them. Catherine turned to him, rain running down her face like tears. Promise me one thing, Ezekiel. When they ask what happened here, don't forget the truth. I won't, he said. They stood together until the roof caved in and the flames roared higher, consuming the house that had devoured so many lives. When dawn came, nothing remained of Cypress Grove but smoking ruins and the faint smell of ash drifting across the fields. Catherine walked away down the road leading north, her figure fading into the gray horizon. Ezekiel turned south toward the swamps, his hand pressed against the paper folded beneath his shirt. Behind them, the plantation burned until the chimneys collapsed, and the fire died with the first light of day. For years afterward, locals would tell stories about that night, about the storm, the screams, the fire that came from nowhere. Some said it was lightning. Others whispered it was God's wrath. Only 2 people ever knew the truth, and they carried it with them into the dark. Charleston, South Carolina. Autumn, 1889. 48 years had passed since Cypress Grove burned. The story had long since faded into rumor, one of those southern tragedies whispered by candlelight but never written down. The land had changed hands a dozen times. The swamp had reclaimed the fields, and the river, thick with moss and decay, carried away whatever truth the fire had not devoured. But sometimes, when the air grew heavy before rain, old people in Colleton County still said they heard cries beneath the ground. They said the house had burned itself. They said it was the land feeding again. The woman who now called herself Catherine Ross lived far from that place, in a small coastal town near Charleston. Her hair had turned silver, her gait slowed by time, but her mind remained sharp as broken glass. Few knew her history. To the townsfolk, she was a quiet widow who kept to herself, ran a small school for poor children, and spent her evenings writing by lamplight. Her neighbors whispered that she must once have been rich, her speech too precise, her manners too refined, but no one dared ask about her past. Every morning she walked the same path to the sea. She would stand for an hour staring at the horizon as if expecting someone to return from it. On her desk, in a locked drawer, she kept 2 objects wrapped in faded linen, a torn scrap of paper with 3 names written in a child's hand: Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, and a single page from the old ledger of the Brethren of the Harvest. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was still sharp and cruel. Sometimes she would unfold it, read the words and whisper, "Never forgotten." Then she would seal it away again. That autumn, a storm struck the coast, fierce, sudden, and destructive. When it passed, Catherine walked outside to find the roof of her cottage half torn away. While gathering the debris, she noticed something lying in the mud, a small iron key, rusted but familiar. Her heart froze. She had not seen it in nearly 50 years. It was the key to Silas Rutledge's study. She held it in her trembling hands for a long time, unsure whether to weep or smile. The past, it seemed, had found her again. That night, she sat by the fire and began to write. Not as Catherine Ross, but as Catherine Rutledge. Her pen moved slowly at first, then faster, as though the years had been waiting behind the ink. June 3rd, 1841, the night my father's house burned. The night I was born again. She wrote until dawn, setting down every detail. The Brethren's rituals, the ledger, Ezekiel's courage, the screams, the fire. She wrote not to confess, but to preserve, to ensure that what was hidden in darkness would one day be known. When she finished, she placed the manuscript inside a wooden box, sealed it with wax, and tied it with string. On the lid, she carved 2 words, "For the truth." Then she took the box to the shoreline and buried it at the base of an old oak, where the tide never reached but the wind always sang. She never saw Ezekiel again after that night, but she heard of him, in whispers, through letters that arrived from strangers who signed only with an initial. He had traveled west, joining groups that guided the enslaved to freedom through the marshes and into the northern states. Later, during the war, he had fought for the Union, rising to the rank of sergeant in a colored regiment. The last letter came in 1865, written in a steady but fading hand. Catherine, the war is over. The South has burned, but not enough. I carry the name still. If you ever wonder whether it was worth it, remember, we lived free. That is the only victory that matters. Ezekiel. She read it until the paper nearly disintegrated. Then she placed it with the names of his family and kept it there for the rest of her life. Colleton County, 1892. The ruins of Cypress Grove were almost gone. Weeds covered the foundation, and vines crawled up what little remained of the chimneys. The locals avoided the place. They said it was cursed, that animals refused to nest there, that birds fell silent when they flew over the old fields. But one afternoon, a group of surveyors arrived, men from the railroad company, sent to measure land for a new line. Among them was a young man named Thomas Reed, barely 20, curious and skeptical by nature. When the others left early, Thomas stayed behind, drawn by a strange sense of fascination. He walked through the ruins until he found what looked like a sinkhole near the center of the overgrown foundation. The air rising from it was cool and damp. He crouched, clearing away branches, and uncovered a half-collapsed stairwell descending into the earth. Against his better judgment, he lit a lantern and climbed down. At the bottom lay what remained of the cellar. The walls were blackened with soot but still intact. Rusted iron hooks jutted from the beams, and shards of melted glass littered the floor. Thomas moved the light carefully, his boots crunching on debris. In one corner, half buried under dirt and ash, something caught the glow. A lump of metal. He brushed it clean. It was a lock, fused shut by heat. Attached to it was a remnant of charred leather. When he pried it open, the leather split, revealing a handful of pages untouched by the flames, preserved between iron plates. They were written in elegant script. The first line read, "The Brethren of the Harvest." Colleton Chapter, established 1800. Thomas frowned, flipping through the pages. There were names, dozens of them, dates, places, descriptions written in cold precision. He didn't understand what he was holding, but he knew it was old and dangerous. He folded the pages carefully and slipped them into his coat pocket. That night, at the tavern, he mentioned his discovery to the innkeeper, an old woman who had lived in the county her whole life. When she heard the name Rutledge, her face went pale. "Boy," she said, "you put those pages back where you found them, and you never speak that name again." "Why?" Thomas asked. "Who were they?" The woman crossed herself. "The ones who fed the land. The ones the fire came for." He laughed nervously. "You mean that old ghost story?" Her gaze hardened. "You think fire burns for no reason? You think the dead forget?" Thomas didn't laugh again. Years passed. Thomas Reed became a historian, then a professor at the University of Georgia. He never forgot the ruins or the pages he had found. He kept them hidden, afraid of what they implied, a secret history of the South that no one wanted told. In 1903, he finally published an article in a small academic journal. It was titled "The Blood Harvest, Ritual and Power in Antebellum Carolina." Most readers dismissed it as fiction. A few scholars quietly noted the uncanny detail, the names that matched old land deeds, the missing families, and then, a month later, Thomas Reed vanished. His cottage was found empty, his notes gone. Some said he'd fled after being accused of forgery. Others whispered that someone had come for him, the descendants of men whose wealth was built on blood. The truth was never found. Charleston, 1895. Catherine Rutledge died quietly in her sleep at the age of 82. The local paper published a brief notice. Mrs. Catherine Ross, beloved teacher and benefactor, passed peacefully at her home near the shore. She leaves behind no known family. She was buried beneath the same oak tree where she had hidden the box labeled "For the Truth." No one knew it was there. The storms came and went. The tides shifted and the years rolled on. Colleton County, 1924. A pair of children playing near the old rail tracks stumbled upon a piece of charred wood in the mud. Beneath it was a fragment of scorched metal engraved with a faded emblem, a scythe crossed over wheat. They took it home, and their grandmother told them to throw it into the river. They didn't listen. They kept it in a drawer, telling ghost stories about the burning house and the lady who rose from the ashes. The legend of Cypress Grove lived on, reshaped, retold but never entirely forgotten. Savannah, Georgia, 1971, in an antique shop near the riverfront. A historian named Amelia Cross, a descendant of freedmen from Colleton County, found an old box for sale. Its wood was dark, its corners sealed with wax. Carved into the lid were two words: "For the Truth." Inside lay a manuscript written in elegant 19th-century handwriting. The first page began, June 3, 1841, the night my father's house burned. The night I was born again. Amelia read through the night, tears streaking her cheeks. She realized the woman who wrote it, Catherine Rutledge, had not merely recorded a confession, but a testimony. And on the final page, in faded ink, was a note written years later. If you are reading this, the land remembers. Let it be known what was buried beneath its beauty. Tell it truly, and tell it well. At the bottom was a signature, almost illegible, but still clear enough to read, Catherine Rutledge, Ross. Amelia closed the book and sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the city lights shimmered on the water, and in the distance thunder rolled, faint, like an echo from another century. She turned the final page over and found something pressed between it and the cover, a torn scrap of paper with 3 names, written in a child's hand, Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. She understood then that the story was not just history. It was inheritance. She decided to publish it, not as fact or fiction, but as both. A story that would carry the truth where records could not. Colleton County, present day. The land where Cypress Grove once stood is now overgrown with cypress and pine. The ruins are barely visible beneath the moss, but on quiet nights, the air still smells faintly of smoke. Some travelers say they've seen lights moving among the trees, lanterns swinging slowly, accompanied by distant voices. Others claim that if you stand by the old river at midnight, you can hear a woman whispering 3 names to the wind. No one knows if it's true, but the locals say this much with certainty. The fire at Cypress Grove never really went out. It still burns, not in wood or stone, but in memory, in the hearts of those who remember what the land demanded and what it finally returned. Epilogue. The truth does not die with those who burn. It hides in the ashes, waiting for someone brave enough to breathe it back to life. Catherine Rutledge's final words, found in the margin of her journal.